Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue with discussion here. Some of the theories that I'm covering are going to get covered again in some later chapters, but I wanted to go back and make sure I mention to you uh, a theorist named Piaget, Piaget, on page 27. Piaget was a cognitive theorist. At this point, and again, I'll go into great detail in chapter 3, but I think it's enough right now if you understand that he believed, and please make a note of this, that we're trying to understand our world. There's a lot of information coming at us for a small child trying to understand the meanings of things and what things are and how they work. And he said in order to not be overwhelmed by all of this information, that we have to organize the information. So first we want to understand it. Second, we want to get it organized. Third, he says we get additional information and we have to, what he says, adapt. So we may have to change our thinking. And so this is constantly going on in Piaget's cognitive theory of development. Understanding, storing, adapting information. And as we do that, we're gathering new information. So he believed in stages. He had 4 stages of development. The stage that we're going to be concerned mainly with in this course is the formal operational stage, which he considered the highest level of thinking. He believed that young people, adolescents, were certainly capable of that. Some other people disagreed, and so we'll discuss that, like I said, in more detail in chapter 3. By the way, sometimes the simplest questions you all overlook. Pay attention to the numbers of stages. If people have stages, you should by this point know that Freud had 5 stages. Erik Erikson had 8 stages. Piaget has 4 stages. So pay attention, because sometimes that's the question, how many stages of development? The third area of theory in the textbook, and again, I know I'm moving quickly, but we do need to get this material done in a fairly short period of time, and that is behavioral. People who believe in behaviorism believe that we learn to be the way we are, and the way we learn is either through observational learning, called social cognitive theory, or through reinforcers and punishers. In other words, your learning is greatly influenced by your environment. So if you do something right, it's followed by a consequence, meaning a reinforcer or a reward, and then you're going to keep doing that because you got something positive from it. If you do something wrong and you're punished, then the punishment is designed to reduce that behavior. And so behavior is, and the name you want to associate here, by the way, is B.F. Skinner. He called it operant conditioning. You engage in the behavior, and then he waits. If you did the right thing, he reinforces it. If you do the wrong thing, he punishes it. And that's called operant conditioning. And so he believed that that's how all behavior is shaped, through those consequences of reinforcers and punishers. So make sure that you understand operant conditioning. Another person that's pointed out in your book is a guy named Bandura. It's a behavior theory, but it's called social cognitive theory. So Bandura believed that you could learn even more quickly through a social interaction with another person who is role modeling for you. And so basically what he believed is that you would role model a behavior, the person would observe the behavior, and then mimic that behavior, and through that process they could learn, and that it didn't necessarily require a reinforcer and a punisher the way Skinner believed. Skinner believed it was absolutely necessary to follow behaviors with consequences, reinforcers and punishers. Bandura said you can use them if you want to, but they're not necessary. The person could simply observe and then repeat it, and through that process learn. Ecological theory, I'm going to make this one simple for you. Figure 11 on page 30. That's Bronfenbrenner's work. The last time I spoke to you about social context, I said that context is the setting in which development occurs. Well, that's basically what Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory is about. He studies the setting in which your development occurs. And so the people that you're interacting with, directly or indirectly, can impact your development. But if you just know that it's called an ecological theory, I think at this point you'll be okay. I'm looking a little further down the page and I see eclectic theoretical orientation. Again, you do need to know this. We've covered a lot of different theories: Freud's theory, Erikson's theory, Piaget's theory, Bronfenbrenner's theory, Vygotsky's theory, information processing theory. So you have all these theories and all these opinions. Eclectic theoretical orientation means that rather than just buy into one theory and ignore all others, you take in the different theories, you use what you like, and you don't necessarily believe all of the theory, but you might like parts of it. And so you might use various theories, various parts of different theories, and that's called eclectic. Now, again, like I told you, the biggest part of the test begins on page 31, methods of collecting data. That's step 2 of the scientific method. I mentioned it in an earlier video, and that the methods are going to be divided into 3 major categories. So make sure that you understand that to begin with. And so the first major category is called descriptive research. So what I'm going to go over very quickly is the different types of descriptive research. In descriptive research, you simply gather the information and report on your findings. The second major category is correlational, and then the final one is experimental. So let's take the descriptive first. And again, I'm going in order of the book on page 31. The first is called observational research. 2 types. One is you can just simply have people come in to a laboratory or a controlled setting and observe their behavior under these controlled settings. If that doesn't work for you, you might use what they call a naturalistic observation, in which you go out into the public and you observe their behavior in a natural setting. So you might observe risk-taking behavior as people drive their cars, and just simply observe, gather your information, and report what you found. The second major one here is surveys and also interviews. So surveys is a quick way to gather a lot of information from a lot of people in a very short period of time. You could just simply send a survey out, ask people to respond. You could do it via email. You could do it through snail mail. You could bring people into a huge auditorium, hand out your survey, ask them to please answer the questions, and then turn it in, and be done very quickly. Another way of gathering information under descriptive would be interviewing. So maybe you want to actually meet the person face to face, and so you interview, you ask your questions, you dismiss that individual, and you bring in the next one, and you keep repeating this until you get all of your interviews done through your questions. Obviously, that's going to take a lot longer, and people may not be comfortable answering questions that may be of a sensitive nature. So a survey sometimes saves you a lot of time, and people might be a little more forthcoming depending on the subject matter. The next one, standardized testing. All of you have taken a standardized test of some sort. So if you've taken an SAT, ACT, the GRE, an IQ test, those are all standardized tests. So they've been given thousands and thousands of times, and they know what the average score is. And so what a standardized test will do is allow you to compare an individual score to all other people who have ever taken that particular test. It is standardized in that the instructions are always the same, the time limits are structured, and everybody takes the test under the same format, and then they can compare. And so that's very useful. On page 32, I see physiological measures. This is self-explanatory. You could gather information, for instance, by checking brain activity. That would be a physiological measurement. The heart rate, body temperature, hormone levels. And so if you wanted to see if increased hormones creates problems for teenagers during puberty, you could take hormone levels and then compare that to their behaviors and see if there's anything going on there. Or you could look at brain activity as they witness a video of some sort. Experience sampling. This one seems a little tricky for the students. I'm not sure why, but basically experience sampling goes back to a method in which they use pagers, or what they used to call beepers, and you just simply page the client who's participating in your research. You maybe have a series of questions that they're asked, and then they respond to those questions. That way they don't have to come in individually, and you can randomly page and maybe even record the questions, and they just simply are being recorded as they respond to the questions. So that's called experience sampling. Case study. Case study is when you have an in-depth study of an individual. So you don't have a lot of subjects in your study, participants. Like if you were interviewing or surveying hundreds of people. In a case study, you have one person. You study them in great detail, and so you know a great deal about that individual and their behavior. The problem with the case study is you can't generalize your findings. So if you surveyed 500 students of a 10,000 student campus, you could then say the students at McNeese University believe this, because you can generalize your findings from your 500 student sample. Not so with the case study. You only have the one subject, therefore you can't say all other people are just like this person regarding whatever the subject you were studying. Descriptive research, again, is summarized for you on page 33. Make sure you go through that list and can recognize an example of descriptive research. The second major category I told you is correlational research. Correlational research allows you to determine the degree of relationship between two variables. So you believe two things are somehow related to one another. Now they can either have a direct relationship, meaning both variables move in the same direction. One increases, the other increases, or one decreases, the other decreases. That's called a direct correlation. An inverse correlation is when one variable increases while the other variable decreases. So as one factor goes up, the other goes down, and that's called inverse. You'll know an inverse correlation, they'll put a negative sign in front of the number, which, by the way, the number is called a correlation coefficient. The correlation coefficient is going to give you a number somewhere between 0 and 1.0. The higher the number, the stronger the correlation, and the more you can predict that there is definitely a relationship. So a 0.75 up to a 1.0 would be a strong correlation. So the number represents the strength of the correlation. The sign in front of the number represents the type of correlation. So a positive sign would be a direct correlation or no sign at all. And a negative sign would represent an inverse correlation. So the sign doesn't have anything to do with the strength. It has to do with the type. The number has to do with the strength. So if you're given some numbers and asked which of the following is the strongest correlation, pick the largest number up to and including 1.0. You can't go past 1.0. If you're asked for the weakest, pick the smallest number, like a 0.25 would be a weak correlation, and would say there's not much relationship between these two variables. So it's very useful. The problem with correlations research is that you cannot determine cause and effect, and that brings me to the final category of research, and that's experimental. So if the question is about cause and effect, that you want to determine if one thing causes some or has an effect on something, you have to do an experiment. Then you can determine cause and effect. In order to do that, you need to set up two separate groups minimum. You have to have an experimental group, you have to have a control group. Without that, you're not setting up an experiment. To get those people into the two groups, you have to do what we call random assignment. So let's say you start with 100 participants. You randomly assign them to one of the two groups. And what random assignment means, obviously, is that you don't interview them and find out things about them ahead of time. If you're wanting to look at appetite suppressant in some new drug that's out there, you wouldn't want to see if they were highly motivated to lose weight and they like to exercise. You would just assign them half to group A, half to group B. One of the group is an experimental group, the other is a control group. That is minimum. You have to at least have that. You can have multiple groups, but you have to have at least the two. The experimental group is the group that you're going to manipulate what we call the independent variable. You need to understand the independent variable is the thing that you believe causes something to happen. So you have this ingredient that you believe suppresses appetite, and that is your independent variable. Well, the result of that after some period of taking this particular product would be the loss of weight. That would be your dependent variable. So your independent variable is cause, your dependent variable is what we call effect or results. That group would get this ingredient, whatever that might be. The control group, on the other hand, is a group in which all things are the same except that ingredient, and they don't get that. You don't manipulate that particular variable. They get a placebo. And at the end, then you can simply compare the two groups. All things being equal, the group that got the independent variable, if they did indeed lose a significant amount of weight compared to the control group, then you could say that that ingredient caused these people to lose weight. And that would be the purpose of the experiment. I wish I had more time to go into more detail with you, but hopefully you're following in the book, you're following the PowerPoint, and you're reading this material. The final thing I'm going to cover as far as just kind of point out the important things before we do a review, hopefully by Wednesday, is time span research on page 35. There's a couple of things I want you to understand. The first one that the author covers is called cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional is used when you're trying to save time, but you need to test different groups of people, but at the same time. So if someone has stages of development and they say when kids are 8 years old they behave this way, and when they're 12 they behave this way, and when they're 20 they behave this way, you have these different ages and groups. Well, you don't want to wait 8, 10, 12 years to compare. You want to compare right now. So you get different groups at different ages, but at the same time. So you might see how a group of 8-year-olds behave and answer questions compared to the 12-year-olds compared to 18 or 20-year-olds, but you do it all at the same time in different, let's say, rooms. You bring them in and talk to them. That would be cross-sectional. Different ages, but at the same time. On the other hand, longitudinal research is especially useful if you want to follow subjects over a long period of time. So let's say you do talk to some 8-year-olds, you ask them questions and you document their answers, and then you revisit those people at 12 years old and you see what changes they have in maybe their thinking or their maturity level or stress or anxiety, whatever it is you're studying. It's the same group of people, but 4 years later. And let's say 4 years later, you revisit that group of people again at 16 years old. So this is real useful for people who do research for a living. For instance, they may study the impact of divorce on generations within families. And so you could follow that family's history through decades of marriage, remarriage, divorce, and so on. And that would be a longitudinal study. And obviously the disadvantage there is that you can't always have the same people return. People pass away, they move away, they drop out of your research, and so on. But keep that in mind. Be aware of the two different types. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and stop at this point, and we'll review, and I'll cover the key terms and key people and kind of point things out to you, hopefully by Wednesday as you prepare for the test. Good luck.